Our next presentation will be by Dr. Martin Hyde. Dr. Martin Hyde is Associate Professor of Gerontology at the Center of Innovative Aging, Swansea University. Professor Hyde is a sociologist with special interest in research on aging and later life. And his presentation's title is Quality of Life, Health Inequalities, Retirement and Consumption in Later Life.
Well, spotted art. Thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this amazing conference and my first hybrid conference. So fantastic work in being able to bring the online speakers and the in-person speakers together. So before I start fully, I would like to say that when I looked at the title that I had originally put down, I realized that if I was to talk about all of those topics, I would probably end up speaking for around about a day or two. And what I thought was be most useful really would be to focus on the central concept here, and one that I think has run through a lot of the conference, which is on quality of life in later life and how we understand it, particularly from for an interdisciplinary conference. I thought it was important to have a discussion about what it is that we are looking at when we talk about quality of life. So I want to really cover 4 main points. So to kind of set the scene about why quality of life in later life is important, and then to talk a bit more about what it is when we talk about quality of life, particularly how we measure it in the studies that we undertake, what we currently know about quality of life in later life, and to talk there a little bit about 2 exciting projects that I've been involved in. One, looking at trajectories in quality of life in later life as we age, and some current work that I'm doing around the impact of COVID-19 on quality of life for older adults in England. And then to finish with some discussion of the current evidence gaps. So what do we need to know? And in particular to try to invite discussion about how we think about quality of life in different international and cultural contexts. So I think most of us recognize the importance of quality of life as a main goal in what we do. So a lot of the work that we do isn't simply to enable people to live longer, but to live longer with good quality of life, happy, healthy, being able to do the things that they want to do, not simply to extend life expectancy with the potential to increase a time of life which is characterized by poor health or inactivity. So I think both the previous 2 speakers have pointed to the need for people to stay active and healthy, and I think quality of life feeds into that those goals. And it's been recognized therefore as one of the key objectives in the International Plan of Action on Aging as far back as 1982, and as a key policy goal for the UN and the WHO as a key outcome as we monitor how well national governments do in order to secure the well-being of their older population. But as the WHO also recognizes, compared to a lot of the evidence or the increasing evidence base about the factors associated with life expectancy and healthy life expectancy, we still lag somewhat in understanding who is experiencing better quality of life as they age and the factors that are associated with that. So I'd say just as quality of life in later life is a key policy outcome, it is also an important research outcome. And I find it, for me, I think it's really interesting and important because it's something that I think, despite some of the wide differences in the research methods we use, the topics that we focus, all of those could be related to quality of life as an outcome measure. And if you think about many of the topics that were discussed yesterday and that will be discussed today, you could draw a line, and there is research that has been done from them to quality of life outcomes. So from metabolic syndrome, work-life balance, Alzheimer's, cognitive function, sight loss, hearing, all of those potentially drive changes in quality of life and are recognized, and quality of life is recognized as a valid outcome measure for practitioners working in those fields, that improving hearing, for example, has benefits by itself, but also helps to improve people's quality of life as they're able to sort of engage more with their environments around them. So I would say, whilst there's probably very little controversy about the importance of quality of life in later life, there is lots of discussion and debate and disagreement about what that actually is amongst people who study it. So there are some key debates about whether quality of life is something that we can say has an objective reality, so something that we can objectively measure beyond the internal interpretation or the subjective interpretation of the individual, or whether quality of life is something that is so innately subjective, so very personal, that we can't measure it in surveys, or that it becomes incredibly difficult to do so and to create any sort of comparative measure to allow us to look at different groups of people, different individuals. Should we aim to sort of get global measures of quality of life? So again, there's lots of work in the field that tries to capture these global phenomena, or do we sort of try to look at individual sort of measures of individual components of that? Within this, though, I think there are a number of general agreements, despite the disagreements. One is that quality of life is something more than just meeting basic needs. So it has some element of well-being, happiness, life satisfaction, purpose. So it's something that takes us beyond just the satisfaction of basic needs, and therefore, by definition, that it is a multidimensional concept, just as life itself is multidimensional. So we need to capture how people feel about all of those components that for them make up quality of life. So the disagreements, or the sort of the discussions about what quality of life is from a conceptual standpoint, also feed through into methodological discussions about how we should measure this. So in my review of the literature, and sort of being involved in doing research on quality of life for the last 20 years, also, I would say there are 4 identifiable approaches to measuring quality of life in later life, in survey research, I should say, rather than qualitative research. Probably the most common way of measuring quality of life is what I call domain or condition-specific quality of life. So by the health-related quality of life, which is more generally about people's functional health. Often the short form 12 is used as an indicator of that, or more, like I said, condition-specific measures around things like Alzheimer's, care, incontinence, cardiovascular disease-related quality of life, hearing-related quality of life, so on and so forth. So they measure, particularly used as outcome measures for interventions or medical procedures, to see whether people with those conditions report an improvement in quality of life after undergoing surgery or other kind of medical interventions. As I said, there is a body of work that tries to look at quality of life as a more global experience, and often these are just single item questions. How do you rate your quality of life? Very good, very bad, or as good as it could be, as bad as it could be. Then there is the sort of index or composite index, or what I sometimes call shopping cart approach, again, which is quite common. So the WHO's quality of life for older adults is a good example of this, where there's a whole range of dimensions that individuals are asked to rank, often relate to quite sensible elements that impact on quality of life: health, finances, social connections, and people rank these again in terms of how satisfied or unsatisfied they are, and these then create a scale of satisfaction of quality of life, so the degree to which people's the dimensions of people's lives are met, or the sort of the desires that they have are met as a scale. And then probably least common in the field are what we call kind of theoretically or philosophically informed measures that have a philosophical basis, that try to capture these more ontological or abstract concepts around quality of life. So one of the ones is a scale that I was involved in developing back in 2003, the CASP-19, which tries to capture these 4 sort of abstract or philosophical elements that we thought were important for quality of life. So control, autonomy, self-realization, and pleasure, the acronym for CASP, and we had 19 items in the end. So you can see there's quite a range of approaches to measuring quality of life. What's probably more kind of concerning is that very few people, when they use quality of life measures in their research, really give a good justification for or definition of why, or justification for the scale they're measuring, or a definition of what it is they think they're measuring. So a relatively recent systematic review found that only a quarter of studies gave a reason for their choice of instrument, and only 13% gave a definition. So if we go back to the WHO's call for better knowledge about this, we need to have a more clear understanding of what it is that we're measuring when we're talking about quality of life in our research. Nonetheless, despite those conceptual and methodological disagreements, I would say that there is an emerging consensus across those scales about the factors that are associated with better or worse quality of life in later life. Probably unsurprisingly, those from lower socioeconomic positions, those with lower levels of social participation, as has already been intimated in the first two speakers in this session, poorer health and poorer functioning, also related to poorer quality of life in later life, depression, as well as sort of general anxiety, also linked to lower quality of life in later life. And something that I think is interesting, given the current WHO global campaign against ageism, is there's some emerging evidence about the negative impact of discrimination and ageism on quality of life in later life. But this is an area that I think much more work needs to be done to look at exactly what the mechanisms are that drive what particular elements of quality of life are impacted by ageism and discrimination, and how that operates across the life course, and whether it intersects with whether ageism, for example, intersects with other forms of discrimination such as sexism and racism. The other big area of research that's been undertaken around looking at the quality of life are life course influences. And again, I think this is terribly important, as we, again, as the first two speakers have said, we don't just kind of appear as old one day from the next. We have a long history of exposure to various challenges, opportunities, advantages and disadvantages as we age, and that brings us to later life with a different set of resources enable us to sort of manage the challenges as we age. So the quote, "We are all in the same storm, but not necessarily in the same boat." Some of us have the luxury liner taking us through our life course. Some of us are stuck in the rickety old sort of paddle boat, trying to make the best we can of it. Again, this area of research isn't without its differences or disagreements about how we measure both quality of life and the life course, but there is again an emerging consensus that those who experience adversity earlier in life, particularly in childhood, are more likely to have poorer quality of life in later life, as are those who've had poorer working conditions throughout the life course. But again, there's a range of different ways in which people conceptualize a life course. Systematic review found this multiplicity of different life course models. So just as with quality of life in general, greater clarity on how we think about measuring those life course trajectories would be important. And then this is some research that I was involved in that got published at the start of this year, which I think is incredibly important, because all the research that I've sort of talked about thus far really takes quality of life as the end point. So life course research looks at how your journey to later life results in better or worse quality of life when you get there, but then doesn't really look at how quality of life evolves as we age. So it really has quite a static view of quality of life. And we were interested to see, well, how does quality of life change as we age? And so a fantastic researcher in New Zealand called Agnes Sasbo, ran these analyses that allowed the different trajectories to sort of come together, very empirically driven approach, sort of called generalized mixed models. And we were able to identify these 5 discrete trajectories of quality of life for people aged 50 and over in New Zealand. And for me, one of the most important stories of these data are the green line, which show increases in quality of life. So often we assume that quality of life continues to decrease as we age. Actually, we do find some subpopulations who show increases in quality of life. That then feeds into some of the research that I'm currently working on at the moment around how COVID has impacted on quality of life. For that, I've done a systematic review of about 50 studies that have looked at quality of life and associated concepts around well-being and life satisfaction. Interestingly, there doesn't appear to be a clear consensus about how it has impacted on quality of life. Some studies see a decline, some studies see no change, 2 studies even found an improvement in quality of life. And we were particularly interested in looking at gender inequality, so whether the impact has been different for men and women. And if you can see on the slide, the graphs on the right-hand side of the screen, we see quite distinct differences between men and women in England for the 3 dimensions of the CAS-19 scale. So in particular, we seem to see that women report lower levels of control and autonomy compared to men during the lockdown periods in COVID-19 in England in particular. But more work to be done here to understand why that is the case and to try to unpack that relationship. So to end, I think really to say there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and I've identified a number of areas where I think research on quality of life will be fruitful. I think we do need to have systematic reviews on non-health related quality of life. There are quite a lot of systematic reviews on health related quality of life, but really to try to find one that looks at trying to synthesize the evidence around the factors associated with better or worse quality of life. Be interested to look at how that differs for different groups in later life. So again, moving away from the idea that the older population is heterogeneous, and think about, are the factors associated with quality of life the same for different subgroups? For example, those with or without chronic illness. Notwithstanding COVID itself, I think there are also a number of other emerging risk factors for disrupting life courses and potentially impacting on quality of life in later life. For example, the rise of the gig economy, move to kind of more artificial intelligence at work, how that impacts on our working lives, for example. And I think this is a particularly appropriate forum to raise this, more research that links biosocial factors with quality of life. There are lots of research on health-related quality of life which clearly show those connections. It would be nice to do more work that looks at those relationships with non-health-related quality of life there. And finally, again, given that we have an international audience, I'd like to end with something that has interested me quite a lot over the last year or two, which is whether quality of life is a universal concept or whether it is culturally specific. And I think all of the different ways in which we kind of measure the quality of life have a sort of an assumption that it does have some universal properties, that it is something, because it is about life, that it's something about the human condition that we can compare across different cultural locations. But during the first year of COVID lockdown, I started reading this excellent book by Julian Baggini on different philosophical traditions, and started to make me think, well, given that quality of life is connected to notions of what constitutes a good life, are we doing enough in quality of life research to look at alternative ways of thinking about what constitutes a good life, or are we imposing largely Western ideas on those on our conception of quality of life? And that came to the fore really in a book that I'm editing about care and living arrangements in India, where we looked at how older Indians conceive of the quality of life, particularly in terms of meeting these intergenerational obligations in this 4th ashram or stage of life in Hinduism, and trying to think about how we can move away from very individualistic, me-centric notions of quality of life, which I think we have in the current literature, just to broaden that out and think about more intergenerational or collective notions of quality of life, about how people achieve those goals. So that's just an area, again, where I think there's lots of fruitful area for kind of discussion and for research to take place. So, Jochen Val, Toda, and thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions, but if you have any that occur to you following the talk, please feel free to drop me a line by email or Twitter.
Thank you very much, Professor, for the beautiful presentation. And we have 1 minute for one brief question. Yes, 2 minutes.
Okay, so first of all, that was really excellent. And I think a major point, at least that I'm taking away from there being midlife or middle age, is that we really have to start a lot sooner. So we keep thinking, everybody keeps thinking aging is, 70, 80, 90. And actually, many would say we start aging the moment we're born. And it's a little bit like when we talk about university students and what they need to know, but really the education about what they need to know should start in grade school or even earlier, that basis. So I think it's the same thing here. We really have to be emphasizing to the younger generation that you really have to start early. Because first of all, the habits develop, right? I mean, whatever you're doing at 20 and 30 and 40, there's more of a chance that you're going to do later on. But also some of the indications that you made really had an influence. Now, we would all like to, in midlife, make more money, right? But maybe there's some other things that we have a little bit more control of. So I think that this was a really important point that you drove home. So it's more of a question, more of a comment than a question. So thank you, that was great.
Thank you, and I think that this is correct. I'm sorry.
Oh, I would just agree very much, and I think again for all of the outcomes that we've looked at, I think one of the big take-homes is it's a life course approach, and we need to think about the things you put in place in order to enable you to age. I really love Professor Harridge's point that do we study aging or old age, and I think we need to move to studying aging and think about that life course model.
Thank you. I think that your comment is correct also for anything related to health, not only quality of life. We should start very early in order to keep it in the best way we can do it. Is there any other additional question? We have time for one additional question. Someone from... Looks like there is one question. Okay, there is one question. Yes. No.
Well, the question is actually from the chat, is how to choose which scale is best for assignment the QOL of older adults.
Personally, I think that the most important thing is to give the justification for why you've chosen the scale, and I think that allows us a better understanding of what it is that we're looking at. I personally feel like it depends on what it is that you're trying to measure. So I think some global assessments, which I tend to use because I do research on more large-scale structural issues and how they impact on quality of life, are not appropriate really for much more precise research, whether it be sort of interventions research or particularly looking at individual conditions. So I think my call really would not necessarily be to what's the best, because I find that a very problematic term, but really just for when people are using quality of life measures to be open about what it is they are looking at when they're talking about quality of life and why they've chosen that specific scale. And I think that would take us a long way to get a better, more comprehensive understanding of this concept.
Okay, thank you very much.